Good afternoon and welcome to EUROMED Migration Talks. I'm your host, Marco Ricorda, from the International Center for Migration Policy Development. And today I will be interviewing Andrew Geddes, a professor in migration studies and the director of the Migration Policy Center at the European University Institute. Andrew, how are you today?
I'm very good, thank you. Nice to see you, Marco.
Likewise, let's dive right in. You are one of the greatest experts on this very topic, so I'd like to question the first question that we ask all our interviewees. If we think about 2015 and 2016, since then and since the so-called migration crisis, the migration narrative in the Mediterranean has been strongly polarized. Now, do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic has actually reinforced or exacerbated this polarization? What are your thoughts on this?
Fascinating thing about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on migration is it's revealed a number of different ways of thinking about migration. So it's probably useful also to step back a little bit and think, well, what is a narrative? Well, a narrative are the kind of stories that people tell themselves about migration. They may not be wholly accurate, but they provide a plausible understanding of what's going on in the world that allows people to make sense of complex phenomena such as migration. And COVID-19 affects these understandings in different ways. So I think it's made us rethink what we understand by essential work, for instance, and the role that migrants can play in delivering essential work in health and social care, agriculture, food processing. That's part of the narrative. At the same time, I think it's also perhaps played into concerns about mobility, borders and security. That's it as a competing narrative. So that I think what we see are in public debate that narratives can be quite strongly polarized. But I think what the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us is there are actually different narratives, at times competing narratives, different ways of thinking about and understanding migration and different ways in which migration is represented. And I think that COVID-19, because of that, provides some challenges for what we do in the future, but also some opportunities there because the way that people have been, in a sense, forced to rethink migration because of the pandemic.
If we look at data, if we look at Frontex data, we can see that actually irregular migration has significantly decreased since 2015. But nonetheless, the public debate on migration, especially in the region we're looking at, the Mediterranean, seems to focus mainly on the negative sides of this phenomenon. Now, you are a very prepared and thorough academic. Can you explain why this is the case?
Well, I think it's a really important question because the way that migration is represented in public debate is crucial because the way it's framed, the way that people see and hear about migration is really important. I think that one of the things that's really struck me since the so-called crisis of 2015-2016 is a very powerful focus on images of irregular migration. And so I think it's become almost, probably the most powerful way of understanding migration in Europe has been a representation of migration as usually African men on boats in the Mediterranean. Now that is not migration to Europe. It's a serious concern for the migrants, for the places they move from, the places they're moving to. This is a big issue, but it is not necessarily an accurate representation of migration to Europe. It's a part of the debate, but I think it's become almost the dominant representation of migration. And I think that through that, it plays into these different and perhaps at times competing narratives about migration. And for some people, activates concerns and fears that this appears irregular, disorderly, and in some way threatening or challenging. And so I think that while it doesn't represent the entirety of migration, what it's perhaps done is trigger concerns people have about what they may see as a kind of migration is disorderly. And I think that can explain why, even though numbers of what would be called irregular crossings across the Mediterranean have decreased very substantially. So the numbers are very, very substantially decreased. And the public debate has been powerfully shaped by these representations of migration as irregular.
Now, let's get a bit deeper into this. In particular, I want to refer to a project called Prospect for International Migration Governance, funded by the European Research Council, where in this framework you led some research on how actors within migration governance systems understand international migration and how these understandings shape institutional responses. Within your research, what were your main findings?
So I think what we did in this was it was a 5-year project comparing the European Union with Southeast Asia, North America, and South America. So it's thinking globally about migration. But what we wanted to understand was how actors make sense of the challenges that they face. So not just to look at the kind of laws and policies that come out of governance systems, but how these actors of various types. So that could be officials, political leaders, people working in international organizations, as well as business leaders, trade unionists, NGOs, civil society organizations, how they try to make sense of the issues and how those understandings can then shape policy outputs. That was what we were interested in doing. If we bring it to Europe and think about what did we actually find in relation to Europe, well, I think what we have found in Europe is that it is understandings of the potential for large-scale and potentially uncontrollable migration flows that has had a significant impact on policy making. So whether real or not, it is concern about large-scale migration flows that's had quite a powerful effect on decision-making in Europe. And we trace it back to the end of the Cold War, where there was concern about large flows from former Soviet bloc countries, through the 1990s with concerns about refugee flows from former Yugoslavia, into the early 2000s with concern growing about irregular flows, and all of that predates what we refer to as the migration crisis. So our concern in this project was to understand, essentially, to kind of put it intuitively, how people who are responsible for making decisions make sense of what's going on out there. What do they think is happening? And what we found is that past experience has played a powerful role in shaping understandings of current events. And so, to kind of put it in a nutshell, we may refer to crises as drivers of policy and policy change. I'd be quite skeptical about that, actually, because what we found is that it is understanding of what is normal about migration that play a powerful role in shaping understandings. And in Europe, it's this sense that migration could be on a large scale and potentially uncontrollable, and whether real or not, that has had powerful effects on policy making in Europe.
Now, ICMPD and the Observatory on Public Attitudes to Migration, OPAM, have collaborated to produce 3 very important studies on this issue. And in particular, I'd like to talk to you about the issue of salience. It's very important to differentiate salience from attitudes to opinions, which are concepts very often put together in the same pot, but they're very different concepts. Now, if we look at salience, we can see how the growing salience of migration in today's political and economic climate has drawn attention to the relevance of regional responses to global human mobility. Andrew, why, how, and with what effects states cooperate at a regional level on international migration and mobility, and what is the impact of regional practices on migration governance?
Well, I think the issue of salience is hugely important. And as you were pointing out, there's a difference between generalized attitudes to migration and issue salience. And it's something that we've been, well, delighted to work with ICMPD on in the context of your important work and also our Observatory on Public Attitudes to Migration. And I think there's something very fundamental about attitudes to migration in Europe, is that they, not only are they relatively stable, but also over time, they're generally becoming more favourable. And I think people often have difficulty accepting that, and yet there is high quality longitudinal data which shows that attitudes are becoming more favourable both to migration within the EU by EU citizens and also from outside the EU. And even at the time of the so-called migration crisis, attitudes continued to become more favourable. Now, that leaves open the question of, well, if attitudes are becoming more favourable, why have we seen a growth in support for political parties which oppose immigration? Well, the answer to that question is salience. That's the importance that some people attribute to the issue and effect it then has on their political behaviour. And what we saw after the events of 2015 was a very significant increase in the salience of the immigration issue, the level of public concern about that issue. And for those who were activating their kind of maybe whose hostility to or opposition to immigration was being activated, that had quite an important effect on their political behaviour. So salience and attitudes to migration, we need to unpick those two. And that's obviously something that we've been very keen to do in our work with ICMPD. And the regional focus for that is also very important, because one of the things that we've been able to demonstrate through our work on attitudes is that migration for many people is seen as a European issue. So, it might be an issue that affects you personally, you might see it as an issue that affects your country, or you might see it as an issue that has a wider European resonance. I think one of the aspects that's very interesting about immigration in Europe is it's seen as an issue which has a regional resonance. It's a European issue. Now, and that draws attention to the importance of regions. We talk a lot about the global governance of migration, but I think what we also see is that regions themselves play an important role in mediating the effects of the global. So we can see that global level agreements have been reached, the so-called global complex on migration, on refugees, but we also see in those documents frequent reference to the regional, because it is the regional level in Europe, in South America, in Southeast Asia, in other regions, it's at the regional level where implementation will need to occur. And so regions are really important in that respect. But there's another way in which regions are also really important, is because they themselves can produce norms and standards. So we see in Europe the production through the common migration asylum policy of the European Union, very important norms and standards which redefine the relationship between states and the international order on asylum, on free movement. And I think that's a really important component of the international system, is the way that regions have become increasingly relevant to the kind of study of international migration, but also to the practice of migration management and migration governance.
In the open studies that we mentioned earlier, there is quite some research about the role of values. We communicate to people in relation to the values they hold. Now, what is the role of drivers and structures of attitudes, and what would you suggest to communication professionals working in the field of migration to tackle this phenomenon?
Well, this is a really important question, because I think it's absolutely fundamental to understand the drivers and structure of attitudes to migration. But in a sense, the driver structure of attitudes to migration are like, or similar to, the factors that structure our attitudes to other issues. We know that our attitudes to most social and political issues are born relatively early in life and powerfully influenced by some of our early life experiences, such as education. So, which perhaps also explains why, once people have acquired their values and ways of understanding the world, they can be quite resistant to change, which goes exactly to your point about communicating to people in relation to the values that they hold. Because I think it's like to be highly counterproductive to communicate in ways that imply that people's values are wrong or need to be changed. Because these, in a sense, are fundamental aspects of people's identity. And to tell them that they are wrong, or even worse, that somehow they are ignorant, is unlikely to be a persuasive strategy. It's likely to be more effective to understand more about values as they are and try and communicate in relation to those values. Now, one of the challenges here is, of course, that many people hold what would be called relatively conservative value orientations with a small c, which means they may value security and order and may see migration as threatening to them if they see it as disorderly, as challenging security in some way. So that might not mean they are necessarily opposed to migration per se, but may have concerns about migration. And so communication which is designed to perhaps appeal to people or make claims about migration which resonates with people's values, which maybe points to for instance, the important economic contribution that migrants make, to the way in which they, in a sense, I suppose the language might not be perfect, but kind of fit in, contribute, make it an important, and as we've seen in the time of the pandemic, a vital contribution to the societies in which we live. And I think it can be counterproductive to perhaps impose a certain kind of narrative, perhaps a more progressive cosmopolitan narrative. It might resonate very well with academics and people who are researching in the field and through their own background might be quite sympathetic to that kind of narrative, but might not always resonate with other people who maybe don't see the world in the same way. And I think that's maybe a more general lesson about political communication, is understanding what seems in many ways a fairly obvious point. To communicate effectively, you need to understand your audience, and it is likely to be very ineffective if you communicate in ways that imply that your audience are stupid or ignorant and that they really need to change the way they think about issues. That's likely to be very counterproductive.
In light of your experience, what could international organizations do to encourage a more balanced narrative on migration? And likely, what are your suggestions for migration practitioners in this regard?
Well, I think that the international organizations play a crucial role in this debate. They and have been very active and increasingly active in thinking about the narratives, the kind of, in a sense, the stories people tell themselves about migration, and the need for these to be perhaps more balanced. And I suppose a balanced narrative necessarily must pay some attention to both the costs and benefits of migration. There are clearly benefits to migration, but we have to be aware that for some people, it brings costs or is seen to bring costs. And so a balanced narrative, perhaps in a sense, has to be a realistic narrative that makes sense to the audience to whom the communication is being made, that it provides some kind of realistic representation which is open to the potential costs or adjustment effects of migration, and the way in which, while migration may be broadly beneficial for a society, there may be some groups in society who may feel more threatened or challenged by migration. And I think, so a balanced narrative, I think, does have to be also a realistic narrative, which is attuned to the real concerns of a potential audience. But I also think that one of the things that is quite interesting in this is we often talk about polarization and imagine this is a black and white debate between those who are in favor of migration and those who are against it. But actually, when we look into this, when we drill down a little deeper, what we see is that many people are persuadable on migration, that they may have some concerns, but they may also understand the benefits of migration and also may also appreciate the kind of the important humanitarian issues associated with international migration as well. So I think that, I suppose it's often referred to as the kind of people thinking about the middle, the people who aren't fixed in their views but are persuadable. And so, a kind of a balanced narrative is actually probably more useful to think about in plural terms, because perhaps many different kinds of narratives need to develop, which are perhaps targeted at particular groups of people and are tailored to their own experiences of migration.
Andrew, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us and to tell us everything about the work you're doing within the Migration Policy Center on the migration narrative in the Mediterranean and beyond. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marco.